From the outside, Edward Langley appeared utterly ordinary. At 48 years old, he lived in a modest suburban home in Reno, Nevada, worked as a bookkeeper for a small logistics company, and occasionally attended neighborhood barbecues. He was the man you'd wave to while mowing your lawn or nod at during a grocery store run. But beneath the veneer of normalcy, Edward harbored a dark, lifelong fantasy, one he had meticulously nurtured in the quiet recesses of his mind for decades. Edward wanted to kill. Edward's fascination with murder began in his youth. Growing up in a strict, joyless household, he found solace in true crime books and documentaries. He was particularly drawn to the minds of serial killers, the precision of Ted Bundy, the audacity of the Zodiac, the methodical rituals of Dennis Rader. To Edward, their actions weren't horrifying, they were art, terrible, grotesque art. Yet, Edward's life took a different path. He graduated college, secured a steady job, and married a woman named Carol. Though their marriage was short-lived, ending in a quiet divorce after 5 years, Edward never seemed outwardly disturbed. He carried on, unremarkable in every way. But inside, the fantasy grew. He dreamed of the power, the control, and the permanence of taking a life. He told himself he'd wait for the right moment. And he did, for 48 years. It was a chilly evening in October when Edward decided the time had come. He'd spent months planning, choosing his victim with care. He wanted a challenge, someone who would test his resolve. He found her, a 27-year-old waitress named Angela Torres who worked at a diner off the interstate. She was young, fit, and unattached, exactly the kind of victim who would take time to notice if she went missing. Edward followed Angela for weeks, learning her routine. He knew when she left work, where she lived, and that she jogged alone at night in a quiet park near her apartment. On a moonless night, he waited in the shadows of the park. When Angela passed by, he struck, choking her into unconsciousness before dragging her into a grove of trees. There, he used a knife he'd bought months earlier but had only now dared to wield. The act was quick but messy, and Edward felt a thrill unlike anything he'd ever known. As he walked away, leaving Angela's lifeless body hidden beneath leaves, he felt reborn. For the first time in his life, he had done something truly extraordinary. Emboldened by his success, Edward took a calculated risk. He decided to travel to another state, both to avoid suspicion and to savor the anonymity of unfamiliar territory. He chose Utah, driving 5 hours to Salt Lake City under the guise of a business trip. This time, his target was a 24-year-old graduate student named Lisa Matthews. He spotted her in a coffee shop, noting her habit of studying late into the night. Edward watched her for 2 days, learning that she walked to her apartment a few blocks away after the shop closed. On the third night, he waited in an alley near her route. He wore gloves and a ski mask, his knife concealed beneath his jacket. When Lisa passed by, he grabbed her, silencing her screams with a hand over her mouth. The kill was smoother this time, more calculated. He left her body in a dumpster, knowing it would be hours before anyone discovered her. Driving back to Nevada, Edward felt invincible. The news reports the next day brought him an eerie satisfaction. Body of local student found, one headline read. No suspects. No leads. Edward had vanished into the shadows, just as he'd planned. By the time Edward reached Oregon, his confidence had grown to arrogance. He selected Portland, a city large enough to offer plenty of targets and distractions for law enforcement. He spent days wandering downtown, observing potential victims, until he found Hannah Clark, a 22-year-old musician who performed at small venues. Edward attended one of her shows, blending in with the crowd. Afterward, he followed her to her apartment, watching from his car as she carried her guitar inside. Over the next week, he observed her schedule, noting her habit of taking late-night walks with her headphones in. On a foggy November night, Edward struck again. He waited outside her building, luring her into a false sense of security by pretending to be a passerby who needed directions. When she stopped to help, he attacked, dragging her into a nearby alley. The act was quick, efficient, and utterly devoid of hesitation. He left her body behind a row of trash bins, confident it would take time for anyone to find her. Edward's final act took him to Idaho, a state he'd rarely visited. He chose Coeur d'Alene, a small city surrounded by lakes and forests, perfect for concealing his movements. By now, he had refined his process to near perfection. He avoided cameras, used disposable gloves, and meticulously cleaned his vehicle after each trip. His target was 25-year-old Rachel Pierce, a retail worker who often stayed late to close her store. Edward followed her home one night, parking several blocks away to avoid detection. He waited until she exited her car, striking swiftly as she reached her front door. But something went wrong. Rachel fought back, scratching Edward's face and screaming loud enough to alert a neighbor. Edward panicked, finishing the job hastily before fleeing the scene. The neighbor caught only a glimpse of him and called the police, but by the time they arrived, Edward was already miles away, crossing state lines back into Nevada. Rachel's murder marked the first time Edward felt vulnerable. The scratch on his face was a glaring reminder of his mistake, and he became paranoid about being identified. He avoided public places, changed his routine, and even considered stopping altogether. But the urge to kill lingered, gnawing at him like an addiction. The media began to connect the dots, though law enforcement remained hesitant to label the murders as the work of a single individual. 4 women killed in 4 states, one article read. Is there a serial killer on the loose? Edward reveled in the speculation, even as he took precautions to avoid detection. Despite the growing attention, the trail went cold. Edward had left no fingerprints, no DNA, no definitive evidence linking him to the crimes. He was a ghost, a shadow moving through the western United States, leaving only terror in his wake. As the years passed, Edward's urge to kill diminished but never disappeared. He often revisited the memories of his crimes, reliving the power and control he had felt. He kept newspaper clippings about the murders hidden in a locked drawer, a secret reminder of his dark accomplishments. Though he never killed again, Edward's legacy remained. The murders of Angela, Lisa, Hannah, and Rachel became part of local folklore, a chilling reminder of the dangers lurking in the most ordinary places. For Edward, it was enough. He had fulfilled his fantasy, leaving a mark on the world that would never be erased. And as he sat on his porch in Reno, watching the world go by, Edward Langley knew he had won. He had lived the life he always dreamed of, and no one would ever suspect him.